I want to start by saying that I could go on and on and on about this, kind of like Sharon was saying, you get me started and I may never stop. So I've asked Nancy to give me the high sign at 10 o'clock so that I can really make sure I'm wrapping it up. So there's a lot here, and I may zoom through some things, but I'll tell you, when I try to eliminate things that I want to talk about, I really struggle, because this is a passion for me. I talk about it a lot, I teach about it a lot, and I do a lot of research on this. And it stems, the work stems from my time as a teacher, as a history teacher and a science teacher. And it stems from my initial forays into the question of what it means to do literacy and to teach literacy in the disciplines. And I need to give a little shout out to two mentors of mine. I'm going to get all emotional, Sally and Michael Martin, who really, I think, in my master's work, helped me move on this path. So I came in as a history teacher and a science teacher who wanted to study literacy, and they helped me really think about what it meant to do that. So thank you to the Martins. Yay. I also need to give a shout out to my dear friend Laura Schiller. Where is she? She's here somewhere. There she is, from the Oakland Writing Project and from Oakland Schools in Michigan, because she's a constant source of inspiration for me as well. So thank you, Laura. All right. Now, with that, let me jump into trying to address these two questions. Why does disciplinary literacy matter? And what should we do about it? And by that I mean, how do we teach it? What is this process of engaging in disciplinary literacy? Now, I need to tell you that I focus mostly on social studies and science in this talk, but I heard there might be some math teachers or people interested in mathematical literacy in the room. Is that true? Okay. Oh, good. Well, I'm not going to talk about that. Sorry. Sorry. But I am teaching a mathematical literacy course right now to pre-service teachers who are math majors. So I would love to talk about it. So if you have questions for me, please throw them at me. And please ask questions as we go along as well. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that sometimes when we hear the phrase disciplinary literacy, we think that it means teaching in the disciplines, and it's only about teaching academic subject area kinds of texts, right? Can you see over here very well? Am I in your way? Because I'm going to move around a lot, so just tell me if I get in your way, okay? So we tend to think that it's about school, but I actually think it's about helping youth navigate from everyday to disciplinary literacy practices and back again. In fact, the subtitle for this talk, in my mind, could be Teaching for Social Justice, because it's about helping kids move across many different domains. The disciplines are just one domain in which literate practice occurs, or each discipline is one domain. And we need to help kids learn to navigate every discipline in the same fluent and proficient way they navigate their everyday lives. So this is work about giving access in my mind. So that's the first definition I would give of what it is. And that's the prior question. Before I can say, why does it matter, we need to talk about what disciplinary literacy is. So I'm going to give you first a definition that I like particularly because I wrote it. And it's the idea that if you're working from a disciplinary literacy perspective, sorry, I'm used to a lavalier mic, that you're really trying to work on giving access to the tools of knowledge production and critique. And it doesn't matter whether it's rooted in the disciplines or in everyday life, but the idea is that you want kids to understand where these ideas, where these concepts, where the knowledge comes from. And one tool for understanding that is through language, is thinking about how we put ideas into oral and written language. And so that allows us to uncover and then teach and practice these different ways of producing knowledge. And once we know how knowledge is produced, then we can critique it. So it isn't really just about teaching kids to be really good science writers. It's giving them access to how science is written so that then they can ask better questions. Now I want to take on the question of discipline versus subject area. Raphael Heller, do you know Raphael? Some of you may know his work. He was at the Alliance for a while. He's writing actually a critique of my piece on foregrounding the disciplines, arguing that the disciplines aren't really what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about the subject areas. And I couldn't agree more. The disciplines are the areas of work, say, a biologist or a physicist or a mathematician engage in. The subject areas are those areas that get brought to life in schools, right? And there are differences between disciplinary practices and subject area practices, because subject areas are in schools, and schools have all sorts of other discourses at work as well. Discourses of control, some of you might be familiar with those. Discourses of relationships, and if you teach adolescents, you're really familiar with those. All these other ways that meaning is made. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm suggesting that we want to just transfer the way a mathematician, let's say, for those of you who are math teachers, would talk and write and practice right into classrooms and make everybody little mathematicians or little historians or little scientists or little literary critics, but that we need to think about the roots of those subject areas and how the disciplines can influence how knowledge is produced. We also need to think about where the discipline isn't influencing how knowledge is being represented, and that is particularly the case with textbooks. So anybody who's studied in the disciplines, let's say the discipline of history, knows that the typical history textbook is really nothing like historical writing, right? And so there's a place where the subject area is vastly different from the discipline. And if we can give kids access to the disciplinary texts, but also help them navigate the subject area text, we're better off. So I want to make sure that I'm going to use the phrase disciplinary literacy, but that you understand that I'm thinking about it in both senses, disciplinary and subject area literacy. Okay, so what are some disciplinary or discipline-specific literacy teaching practices and strategies? Well, to get at those, we have to ask ourselves, what do people in the disciplines do? How is language used on a daily basis? What kinds of texts do disciplinarians turn to or produce as part of their work? And what role does the text play in the work that they're engaged in? How are interactions with members of the disciplines shaped or even governed by text? And this is especially important in some areas where text has been eschewed or even reviled in, say the last 20 years. Science is a particular area where the focus on, inquiry and moving away from reading about science has led some science educators to say text is bad. When I first started working in our science curriculum project, I was told repeatedly, whatever happens, the text will not take over this curriculum. It was like, okay, I really wasn't suggesting that. But I was suggesting that scientists do use text. And so we might want to think about how they use text, how their work is shaped by text, and in some cases, even governed by it. And then, who are the primary audiences for written work in the disciplines that shape the subject areas you teach? Those are really important questions to ask yourself as you think about what you might want to do with kids to help them enter into conversation with the disciplines. Another set of questions that I think are even more interesting, because these start to get at the nitty-gritty, what are the standards for warrant demanded by the audiences in those disciplines? And that's going to shape then genres of text and registers of text, how text can be written, what gets accepted, what's valued. Warrant really differs, how we use evidence really differs from one domain to the next. And this is a place where we've done some work with kids, helping them understand the difference between the kind of warrant they provide in everyday life and the warrant that they would need to provide, say, in science writing. The next two questions I think are really interesting too to ask yourself. Are there words or phrases that are demanded by or absolutely taboo that you wouldn't use at all in the discipline that shapes your subject area? Now, we have to be careful there because sometimes people think that there are words or phrases like I, as in, me, that are taboo in, say, the sciences, when that actually isn't the case. So I spend a lot of time actually working with graduate students who have come to believe that social science writing, it has to be in the passive voice. And in fact, if you look at something like the APA manual, that it tells you to always use the most active voice you can use. And if that involves using I, then you use the word I. So we have to be a little bit careful about assumptions that might be made. But we can actually engage kids in conversations about that. When would you use certain kinds of words and when wouldn't you? And then two, writing styles. And then this again goes to genre and register. So again, these are all important questions to ask ourselves as teachers to help us think about, well, what does it mean to do work in a discipline? And then finally, what's unique about the discipline in terms of reading, writing, speaking, and listening? Now, I gave these questions to a set of 4 members of 4 different disciplines: English, English literature in particular, history, mathematics, and the sciences. Actually, the person was a chemist, but he was representing the sciences. And they came up, and you're not probably going to be able to read these in real detail, but I would be happy to make these available to you if you're interested in them. What I wanted to show you was the kinds of lists they came up with. I'm only showing you history and mathematics, so there you go, math people, you got something in this talk. Just so you can see both the differences in how they think about their practices. So this was this question of, what do you do every day? What are your practices every day? And then getting them to think about what's the role of reading, what's the role of writing, or really what's the role of language in those practices. And it's really interesting, like look at the first two. In history, and this comes from Bob Bain, my colleague at the University of Michigan, you frame historical problems. That's the first thing you do as an historian. Now, think about how we read textbooks, right? And what we might do. I was a history teacher, so I'm going to say what I did when I taught history. I was only 21, so, forgive me. But, it was open. We're going to start with exploration and conquest. That's where you start, right? Because it was U.S. history. So open the book. Okay, we're going to read about exploration and conquest. Why? What's the historical problem? Why do we care, right? So that's what an historian does. And many of you are probably sitting there thinking, well, that was just bad teaching, Elizabeth. You should have known better. And yeah, it was. But if you think about it in terms of, I'm really helping kids engage in the questions of history, it takes on a different meaning for you. It's not just about giving them a purpose. Going back to those generic literacy strategies that I think Nancy mentioned, we all know that purpose setting is very useful in helping kids read. But this is about the bigger purpose. Why are we even engaged in these questions, right? Framing historical problems. In mathematics, however, it's different. You ask natural questions. This is from Hyman Bass, who's a world-famous algebraist, the developer of K-theory. Ask natural questions in a given mathematical context. Again, how much of our mathematics instruction is about starting with questions, right? It's typically about starting with some sort of concept like functions. Why? Why do we even look at functions? What is a function? What does it do for us? It's going to actually answer a natural question, how this is related to that. Right? That's what the purpose is. So these were really useful to me in thinking about the differences and the similarities, because notice both of them are starting with purpose setting and with asking questions or addressing problems, but they're framed slightly differently. And as you go down the list, you would see the differences are a lot about language, the way they talk about the practice. The other thing you would notice if you went down the list is how much text and how much language matters. One of the ones that's really interesting, let's see if I can find my pointer, is High's point about using appropriate conventions to produce aesthetically pleasing results. And he spent, I know, mathematics, right? Yeah, I know, it's aesthetically pleasing. It's just like this room. Lots of proofs all over the board in this room. He really, though, is very picky about precision and how mathematical language is all about defining with precision and elegance. He talks a lot about elegance. So, there's some things that if we turn to the disciplines, we start to think very differently about our subject areas and about what we're teaching. And sometimes we might even be teaching things that are actually antithetical to the work of the disciplines. Okay, so that actually both tried to address what disciplinary literacy is and started to sneak into why it matters. And I've talked a little bit about it already. I see it as an act of social justice or teaching for social justice. But let me just get more specific. So one of the things I would say is that we have such disciplinary slicing in middle school and high school and the university, even sometimes starting at elementary school. How many of you are elementary teachers? Yeah. So you start to see some, departmentalization. Some teachers are teaching science versus reading. Maybe not as much these days, but it is possible that you'll see this in elementary school as well. But for me, because of my work with adolescents, I worry a lot about this cutting up of the school day and the lack of coherence that kids experience. But I also worry that when we slice things up into these subject areas or disciplinary pieces, we mask the role that the practices play in knowledge production, and we also reify disciplinary differences. Now, this is really interesting because I've had a lot of people critique my argument about, including Raphael, about disciplinary literacy by saying that actually reifies the disciplines. It makes the disciplines seem as if they're in nice, neat little boxes. But I actually see the work of disciplinary literacy as helping kids get deeper into the discipline so that they can then see, oh, look, there are some things that are shared, and more important, that they can see that these are human constructions. The so-called rules, the things that are taboo, the things that are demanded, those are demanded by human beings. They're made up. They're not, they don't exist out there on some tablet. Like I remember from my dissertation work, I had this really interesting interview where a young woman told me she loved chemistry because it was so organized. It was perfect. And then she said, look, and she pointed to the periodic table of the elements, and she said, it's all right there. I'm like, they didn't dig that up and, dust off the sand, right? Somebody put that together. They organized it. I mean, yeah, there's a sort of natural order to these elements, but you could have put them in a different order. So this is what I think disciplinary literacy does for kids. It starts to uncover the ways that, this isn't actually natural. This is a social construction. Because of that, I would argue, provides greater access to more young people. Now, some of you might be sitting out there saying, I work with really struggling readers. I work with kids who really struggle to write. How could this possibly help? Disciplinary literacy, that's for kids who are advanced. I completely disagree with that. I believe that giving kids access, and I work in Detroit, which is a place where, about 70% of our youth read 4 to 5 grade levels below their current grade level. So I understand about struggling readers and writers, believe me. But when we engage kids in these conversations about text, they have a different kind of access, and they start to learn the words differently. They start to read more proficiently, because actually many of them read really proficiently outside of school. I follow them around outside of school too. I always get permission, but I do follow them around, and I see that they're reading really well when they know the subject, when they care about the subject, when they're engaged with it, they can read it. So to me, this practice inside school could really get kids engaged with the subject. It certainly is done in the service of enhancing subject matter learning. So, we've got a federal government right now who's very interested in mathematics and science instruction and ramping things up in math and science. And In some cases, their argument is to get, to do away with the writing instruction and with literacy instruction and focus on just teaching math and science. But I would argue that this is a way to actually teach math and science more proficiently. And then finally, of course, I think it's building critical literacy skills. I live in an area that had, when we moved to the community, there was an O4 dioxane spill by a chemical plant in the area into a creek called Honey Creek. And the literature that was sent repeatedly to our home from both the industry and the SIO Residents for Clean Water was fascinating. It was fascinating to read the rhetorical argument that was being made and the way, O4 dioxane is really not that bad. It's really, only kills people sometimes. It was like that kind of language in the industry newsletter, and then the SIO Residents letter was very strident in the other direction. So, having access to really say, well, I don't think this argument is quite right. I think they're making a causal claim when it's really only correlational. That's the kind of work that we can do in disciplinary literacy instruction that gives kids access to be more literate citizenry. Now, I'm so glad Nancy mentioned the generic literacy strategies. I wanted to say a word about that because, I come out of a background where we learned about content reading strategies, right, Michael and Sally? And these are powerful and important strategies. There's a little bit of a messiness because, of course, there's the strategies that good readers use when their skill breaks down. That's this list right here. Then there are the strategies teachers use. I try to move now toward talking about teaching practices to avoid that confusion between the strategies a reader uses versus the ways that teachers might help kids learn those strategies. So right here, I'm talking about generic literacy skills and strategies that a reader might use. Predicting, previewing, questioning, monitoring, visualizing, and summarizing. We know that this is what good readers do when their skill breaks down. That's the other thing I distinguish between, and the field distinguishes between skill and strategy. You don't need to teach strategies to kids who are skilled readers, right? They'll be strategized to death, and they get really resistant to the breaking up of text. Claire White tells this wonderful story about her son Diego, who said, she asked him, what are you looking forward to in school? And he gave some answer, and she said, well, what are you not looking forward to? And he said, metacognition. She said, really? What is metacognition? He said, thinking about your thinking, learning, about how you learn. Fourth grade. And then she said, I know, this is terrible, I'm telling her story. Like, I don't have my own stories to tell. But she said, so I'm curious, when do you do metacognition? And he said, November. Yeah. So, seriously, Claire White, you got, let me give you the source for that. You can check with her. It's a beautiful story, though, of how kids can be over-strategized. The kid didn't need to learn more about metacognition. He needed to move to disciplinary literacy. But what's important is that these can be skills, but they can also be strategies we use when we confront a text that's challenging. So, most strategy instruction is attempting to develop these strategies and skills in readers. But the question is, well, then what's the relationship between this and disciplinary literacy? Well, I would argue that all of these hold. These are all relevant in the disciplines, but they get actualized or operationalized differently. So think about previewing like an historian, right? What does an historian do? And if you're familiar with Sam Weinberg's work or Bob Bain's work, you know that the first thing they want to know is who's the author? Who wrote this? Because that matters a lot in history. That's enormous in understanding, especially with primary sources, the point behind the piece. When was this written is absolutely critical, and what's the context? So that could be when it was written, but also what was happening in the world at the time this was written, which might then get to the purpose. Previewing like a biologist can be quite different. It's still asking framing questions. It's still previewing, but it's what's the problem I'm studying? Because I want to read this in order to advance my knowledge, to prepare for an investigation, or to understand my results. So I have something I'm trying to do. It's a little bit more utilitarian at some level. And then what do I already know about the phenomenon, and what do I predict? So scientists really want to have some hypothesis, and they may have something already. They may have findings, and they're checking those. So those are some of the differences. Here, let me just give you a quick example. In history, this is one of my, this is actually what I did with my kids, and one of my favorite preview guides that I used to use. So if I told you you're reading a chapter from the book A Nation of Immigrants, what do you expect it would be about? Immigrants. Who? Which immigrants? Who? To the United States. Why to the United States? I heard somebody else say that too, but I'll pick on you. Okay, so you've already given it a context that's based on your own experience, right? So you're previewing as an historian. What's important here is that, of course, an historian wouldn't just approach a book or a text not having any sense of where it came from, right? So this is where you can raise for kids the thought about, well, wait a minute, how do I know what the context is? Right? I'm going to have to use my own experience here, but historians wouldn't actually be doing that. They would, of course, use their own bias and experience, but they would also already have a sense of what this book was about, what its context was, because they'd have more information. So what if I told you, wait, did anybody else have a different nation that you might predict? Austria? Okay. Oh, Australia. Okay, Australia. Why Australia? Because of the penal colonies, because we know lots of people from different countries went to Australia. So that's a way, I mean, it's a great, this is like the generic literacy strategy, right? It's kind of like a KWL. You can get the knowledge out on the table, you can get kids thinking about it, but you can also make evident to them how an historian might approach this text very differently. For example, what if I, see if this works, told you that the book was written in 1961? How would that change your prediction? Would it change it at all? Yeah, not necessarily. Yes?
Well, I would make a very personal connection because I immigrated in 1960. So I would say, okay, that's a year after I came, and what do I remember about my experience?
Perfect. So you would be drawing on your own experience. Again, the historian would have chosen this text for some reason. Right? So the historian would have already had a problem framed. So you could help kids see how now you're bringing a kind of problem to it. You're framing your own problem. But if you're doing the work of history, you've approached the text with that problem in mind. Who else had a different prediction? Yes?
A lot of the immigration before 1960 was European. It wasn't until 1980 when they reversed the European immigration.
Okay, so you're then starting to make a prediction about who's going to be featured in this text, right? So it's probably going to be more European than, say, Mexican, Cuban, maybe Cuban, but, right? Asian, right, exactly. Okay, good. So now, what if I told you the author was John F. Kennedy? How would that change your prediction? Does it reinforce yours? Yeah, okay. And now we know why it was written in 1961 and not 1985, right? Although some of our students might not know that, so we would have to help them understand. But you know, you're building knowledge, right? So you can actually build knowledge as you're doing this. How else might it change your prediction? Yes?
There's a political edge to this piece.
There's a political edge. Why do you say that?
Because he's the president of the United States at that time. He got there through lots of very fancy politicking. Probably wanted to stay there through lots more fancy politicking.
Very nice. And of course, with kids, we could go on and we could start digging down into how does this reshape your thought about the context? How does that change various predictions that you've made? How do you think now when you know the author? And so by actually revealing this in a kind of reverse order, you help to underscore the importance of the author. You help kids understand the work of the historian really is about knowing that individual. Okay? And that's how this is. It's still this generic literacy strategy, but it takes a different twist. It has a different focus when you're doing it, let's say, for the purpose of producing an historical account. Okay, we're going to skip this because I'm worried about time, but you can see, you could start to think about, well, what does it mean to preview like a mathematician? This is the hardest in English language arts. What's the discipline that you would be aiming for? Is it the literary theorist, the literary critic? Is it a writer? But you could do lots of things with that, because think about that, really helping kids start to think about, well, what are the disciplines that undergird the English language arts? What does that mean to be a member of the discipline if you're in English language arts? You could be a journalist. You could be lots of different kinds of people, professions, and disciplines. So that's actually a really fun one, but we're going to skip it. You don't get to have fun. Because I want to quickly move to another example of differences across the content subject areas or disciplines, if you will. This is where it starts to, though, really be about subject area. Okay, so think about like the difference in genre between a letter to the editor, which asks for usually a very personal opinion or personal experience, the essay or poem for an English class, and then the social science essay. These differences, which are sometimes very subtle, but sometimes very powerful, are a real source or potential source of confusion for kids. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when I get into the piece on writing, because what we're seeing as we work with kids in writing, particularly writing and social studies, they're very confused because they've been taught some very different rules for writing in their English classes. And they've been taught them as rules. So I'm going to rush past this so I can get to that, so we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, so here's the what to do part. What are we going to do about disciplinary literacy? Nancy, how's my time? Okay, great. That's perfect. Okay, so the work to be done, I would say, is in disciplinary reading and disciplinary writing. That's how I'm going to separate these. And I want to start by talking about disciplinary reading. A lot of people think this means teaching kids to read like an historian, like a scientist, like a mathematician. And that is part of it, right? So I've been kind of talking about that. But there are some other things to be done. One is the idea of drawing from and developing what I've been calling necessary knowledge, what Pat Alexander talks about as bridging knowledge. And this is, I still struggle to define this and to capture what I really mean by it. But it's basically the space between the knowledge the kid brings to the table and the information or the ideas or the concepts, the knowledge you want them to get from a piece of text. There's other stuff that you have to know to get from here to here. And I think that we've been tending to focus on the knowledge that's in the text. Even like our test questions, they focus on what's in the text. But we need to help make sure that they've got the knowledge that they need to get from what they know to what they want to pull or what you want them to pull from the text or the meaning you want them to make in the text. I'm going to try to give you an example of that in a minute. I think this requires a lot of work around talking about texts and really text-focused work. What I'm seeing as I'm working in classrooms is lots of talk and some text, because I'm in these classrooms, so these are places where teachers are using a lot of text. There are lots of classrooms where text isn't actually being used very much, and by that I mean print or other kinds of visual text. But what I'm not seeing, even in classrooms where lots of text is being used, is talk about those texts, really about the text. Like, well, how do you know that? Show me where it says that in the text. Let's take that apart. What does that word mean? How does that word signal to you this inference you've just made? That's absolutely critical work. Synthesizing across text is another piece, and we know from NAEP data that this is actually what keeps kids from moving from basic, and okay, so we might have some problems with these tests and labeling kids in these categories, but let's just say that we recognize that basic readers can get the main idea out of single text. Proficient readers can read across texts, and lots of kids are sitting at basic. I think it's because we don't do enough of what Phyllis Blumenfeld calls coming back around, coming back to a particular piece of text and saying, let's look at how this text and this text are paired. And then finally, teachers taking on texts. So we have lots of bad text available to us as teachers, really, really horrible text. Are there any publishers, textbook publishers in the room? Okay, really, nobody? Okay, so a lot of those are textbooks that, and they cost a lot of money, and that then puts a burden on all of us to then find other kinds of texts. But those texts aren't necessarily easy to read for kids either because they weren't written to be read by kids. So in either case, whether we're working with a textbook or whether we're working with wonderful archival documents, we've got to take those on. So I'm going to show you some questions that I think we should ask of text. Okay, so first, drawing from and developing necessary knowledge. I'm just going to tell this story very quickly. I was teaching an immigration unit, and forgive me, like Laura, you've heard this before, but I taught for 2 weeks, first, third, and seventh period, global issues class, and we did this unit on immigration. It was so cool. It was great. We had writing built in. We were going to have write essays at the end that they could take to the May Day March. This is a predominantly Latino school. We knew immigration mattered, no matter whether the kids were, pro-immigration or anti-immigration, because this is a community where there are lots of immigrants, and so there's lots of, heightened sensibility about immigration. We knew it was a topic of great interest and passion for the kids. We wanted to take them through the history of immigration law in the United States so that they would have stronger arguments to make about current immigration law. So we were trying to embed an understanding of their own experience and their own views about current immigration law in this larger historical picture. And it doesn't, I don't know how many of you studied immigration law, but it's extremely discriminatory throughout our history. It discriminates against all different kinds of people. And so we knew that was a theme that, you'd almost have to be, inorganic matter to not see, right? So we knew that this was going to be something that they'd kind of get excited about. So we had our first activity beyond the daily writing prompts that we did as our Do Now activities. We had them each table take an immigration law. We had done some other things too. We started with Emma Lazarus' poem that's on the Statue of Liberty, and we deconstructed all of that. We did really very exciting, fun work, looking words up in the dictionary together, writing them on the board, doing morphemic analysis, all this great stuff. And then we did the laws, and each table had to illustrate the law. And everything was going well as long as the students had laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, because it was very concretely stated. But then they got to the laws of 1921 and 24. Is anybody familiar with these laws? The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the 1924 immigration law. And those laws are written so that they look quite equitable. It's 2% of any 3% in 21 of any group resident in the United States in 1910 could immigrate. And then in 1924, they realized they were letting a few too many Italians slip in, so they made it 2% of any group resident in the United States in 1898. Right. Well, the kids looked at these, especially the groups who had to draw them, and they're like, what do I draw? 2% of people resident, but not to mention that we had to do a lot of deconstruction of the language, like the word resident, the word alien, things like that. But then they also just didn't understand what it meant. So we realized, I was co-teaching with a student teacher of mine, we realized that we hadn't built the necessary knowledge, that we assumed that they would have the necessary knowledge, not just at this sort of intellectual level, like I know that was a time of an influx of Italian immigrants, Romanian immigrants, but also that they would understand what was going on with Italian immigration, like why people might not want Italians to come into the country. So these were juniors. They had had a 9th grade US history class, so they had learned it, but they hadn't really developed it as necessary knowledge. So we did this. We put stats in front of them. Now, we were very fortunate. We had a computer in the room. We got on the U.S. Immigration Bureau, pulled up the statistics, could print them off, and put them up in front of kids. We didn't want to just tell them. We wanted to build the knowledge. We wanted them to reason through. We wanted them to learn to ask the question, why wasn't it an emergency? What's the emergency here, right? Right? And why 1910? Why 1898? So when you start to look at the stats, you see some, let's see if this works, yeah, some really interesting things happening, right? You see in 1920, what's happening? German immigration and Italian immigration are starting to look on par, and look over here in 1890. Sorry, it was 1890, not 1898. I don't know why I said 98. So, we're seeing a drop in German immigration, and we're seeing an increase in Italian immigration. And all we had to do was put that in front of them and then help them think about how you read a table. And we were starting to build necessary knowledge. Then we showed them this one, which we pulled straight down from the website. And here, of course, the table is completely different. So again, how to read the table it's a different arrangement. The year is down the side now, and the country is across. But they were pretty quick in figuring out what the emergency was and why in 1924 they decided to go back to 1890, and look what happened. Look at the results. That's what I mean by building necessary knowledge. But you know what? There was still a piece they didn't understand. Why would anybody not want Italians? There's white people. This is a classroom of predominantly Latino and black kids, and they're like, what? Why? I don't get it. So here we went, it was a little dangerous, but we actually started showing them images and asking them to think about who might the U.S. want and who might they not want, or who would be included and who would be excluded, on what basis. And it was, at that point, it was really interesting. I don't have this particular image here, but we showed them a picture of a big group of Italian immigrants, and in every class they said, well, they don't want them, they look Mexican. That was their response. But that was, again, a kind of necessary knowledge, a very profound kind of knowledge that helped them then turn back to that text and read it quite differently. So that's one piece. Now, talking about text, I don't have a lot of slides for this, because the point is, and I saw you two looking at each other, I can tell talking about text is very important to you, is getting into the words, getting into the language, really turning to that text and using it. So what we did in this unit, when we had the Lazarus poem that we started with, and we spent a full class period on that one poem, and not even the whole poem, making sure that everybody understood it. We showed them a picture of the Colossus, because it starts the new Colossus. They had to understand what the old Colossus was, right? Like, what does that mean? And why might Lazarus have used that image? And then when we got to I think it's the law of 1903, there's this whole law about how we're not going to have any morons and paupers and hungry people and dirty people. They're all going to be excluded. And we popped Lazarus' poem right back up. And we said, I don't get this. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. How does that jibe with this law? Well, I don't know how many of you know this, but Lazarus wrote the poem in protest of that law and of the treatment of poor people. So then, wow, how exciting was that, right? To kind of build that understanding and that power, but we had to go back to the text, and we're like, pauper, what's a pauper? Let's look it up. Okay, pauper, the definition has the word poor in it. That's in Lazarus' poem. That's what I mean by talking about text, really getting into the text. And that is also what I mean by synthesizing or coming back around. So, analyzing the text of instruction. This is, I think, really important work, and it's probably the least fun because it involves really taking a look at the text that we give kids before we give them the text and being able to predict what the challenges of that text will be and being prepared so you can be flexible. Like, we should have known better when we taught this immigration unit. We should have known that the kids might not understand those laws. But you know, we actually thought, oh, we're gonna have to teach them these words. We're gonna have to teach them what 2%um means. We're gonna have to do those kinds of things, but we didn't think about building that necessary knowledge. So sometimes you're gonna analyze text and you're going to do the kind of work that we did. See, we had done all of this piece and we were really prepared for that, but you won't always hit it. But I think having analyzed it, you can then make very quick decisions to intervene when you figure out, oops, missed something. This is just the set of questions that I think need to be examined when we're thinking about the nature of the text. And I wanted to recommend to you this tool. It's called Comatrix. It's absolutely free. You can go online, you can take a piece of text, you do have to type it in yourself. You can't like scan something and pop it in. It's developed by Art Grazer and Daniel McNamara at University of Memphis. And it will analyze the text for you on multiple dimensions. And this is what I love about it. It's not simply a Lexile score. Lexiles are very useful. I'm not dissing Lexiles, but can you tell I hang around with kids too much? But Lexile is just one dimension of the complexity of a text. And that's what Grazer and McNamara do. They show you, wow, the Lexile might be perfectly appropriate, but guess what? There's no referential cohesion in this text. In other words, it's really hard to follow the references throughout the text. Okay. Does that mean it's 10:15? 10, perfect, thank you. So I strongly recommend this tool for you. What Comatrix won't do is it won't help you analyze the relationship between the text and the reader, and they fully acknowledge that. They understand that this is for the piece of text qua text. But what we also have to think about are the issues around how our students are going to interact with text. And one of the things that I really push, particularly with my pre-service teachers, for those of you who are working with pre-service teachers or with new teachers, is the difference between the challenges they see in the text and the challenges kids might see in the text. It's very easy, like we did with the immigration text, we just automatically bring that necessary knowledge to bear, but kids don't always. And so part of the work of analyzing is asking yourself that question. And then finally, the notion of selecting other text to accompany the text that you're using for instruction, particularly if it's a difficult text. So some of my work in science has been to build what we are calling text sets, so that we actually we write cases, so like a problem actually that we've set up, and then we find real-world text. Let's say in this case it was about chemical reactions, so we took a real-world text about a car rusting, and then we have text that's more expository in orientation. Either we write it or we pull it from textbooks. And that way, the difficult, sort of dry expository text can be scaffolded by the problem that you've built for the kids, or by the real-world text. In science, there are a lot of problems with real-world texts because they tend to anthropomorphize things. They tend to represent things, especially like newspaper articles, will represent things as causal when they're really only correlational. So you can actually, by putting the right text together, you can create a kind of scaffold across text. And it's great for struggling readers because now they're reading the same words multiple times. One of the things that I think we struggle with a bit in literacy is that we focus on multiple forms of representation. I know Steve's doing this work, but we don't always focus on multiple forms around the same concept. So I found myself often having lots of cool things, lots of ways in, but not all to the exact same concept. So if you can think about how, this notion of transmediation, that if I can show a visual image, print, another form of print that's talking in the same way, but maybe it's narrative instead of expository, the kids are going to have a more a scaffold, a deeper meaning built across those. So, and then you of course have to think about, how would you help them make those connections? That also helps them to do the work, I'm skipping that, of synthesizing across texts. Okay? And that, again, is absolutely critical. As we bring kids to multiple texts, we have to think, how do we help them make connections? So here's a very simple, again, generic literacy strategy or practice that you might use with kids called synthesis journals. How many of you have heard of these before? They're really simple. You can have a notebook, the kids, and you try to keep it on a piece of notebook paper so it's small. So they have the center circle, and then they have different sources. And you can do this in anything. You could do it with pieces of literature. You can do it with primary sources in history, with scientific sources. And the goal is they write a summary of each of those texts, but the real meat of the work is when they bring it all together. What's the analysis that I would do across texts? What do all these texts have in common? Where do they sort of dispute each other? And the reason that I like to keep it on a single page is that it really focuses them on not simply just copying all of the information, but what's the synthesis of each text, and then how do I bring them together? This is another one of my favorite strategies. This is actually a little more effective. It could be in any subject, but I really like it in science. It comes from Elaine McLaughlin. It's actually a pretty old strategy called Questions into Paragraphs. This is really useful for struggling writers who really don't have a sense of how do I write a report? How do I know when one idea starts or stops and another idea starts? And so the idea here is that you might start with this driving question. We use learning sets, so we also want to remind them of the learning set question. And then they develop sub-questions, and then they have multiple sources, and they try to take notes on each question from each source. And in this bottom, I don't know why I'm pointing with no pointer, right here, they summarize across the sources, or across the questions, and here they summarize across the sources, and here, again, very small, they try to come up with a kind of primary assertion or a claim. And that's why I really like it in science, because it actually really pulls them to making a claim. But it's really just a form of synthesis. Okay. Disciplinary writing. I'm going to try to do this in the next 5 minutes that I have, right? 10? Okay. There are two things that I think we need to do. We need to expose kids to multiple forms of writing. I know you all do this well. You're all part of the National Writing Project, so you don't need me to tell you that, but we need to help, I think, teachers across the disciplines think about exposing kids to multiple genre and register. And we need to help them learn to write in those genres and registers very well. The point here, the multiple piece, is really important within the discipline. It's not just across. It's helping kids understand that even for the scientist, there are times when I write in a journal. And then there are times when I write a log where I'm keeping track of data. And then there are times where I write a report. And I might just write myself, funky notes. And I have my little journal that I, carry around to come up with ideas, like when something occurs to me. Oops. So it's really helping them understand that there are multiple ways to produce an idea. Let me show you opportunities to write. This is a poem that one of the kids I work with wrote for his English class. Now this you probably won't be able to read at this table over here. It's a poem about Detroit. I'll read it very quickly. It goes, Motor City of the world, automaker and designer, a player of cars and casinos, a city of violence. They tell me you're the #1 murder city, for I have seen your people in streets. They tell me you are feared and violent, and I have seen the results of that with my friends who have passed away. For the people who want to show me the good side, I'll show them my reality, the view that only only people who live here see and hear. Gang violence, gunshots, drug dealing, rapists, prostitutes, crackheads, bumps, thieves, burn houses, and dirty streets. All of this hides under those beautiful buildings in downtown. Under the unknown places of the camera hides this terrible everyday dilemma we have to go through. Underneath the streets of Detroit hides its people, and underneath those people, their solidarity towards society. And that's a pretty powerful poem, right? And he's a pretty powerful kid. This next piece is a piece of writing that a kid had to do for social studies. And I won't read it to you, but as I talk about it briefly, just take a look at the themes. The themes are very similar to the themes in that poem. And this kid didn't get a passing score on his social studies writing because what he really wanted to write was about gang violence. What he really wanted to write was a poem or a statement, something that was personal to him. And one of the things that we're playing with right now is that we have kids who are having to write. Now, the state of Michigan has done away with the social studies writing test, both to my joy and chagrin, but they, in the past, had to write to these prompts that were highly personal. They were so connected to kids' everyday lives that the kids couldn't always do the objective social science writing that they needed to do. So we're trying to work on how we engage them in writing many different ways, even though we know they have this writing prompt they might have to speak to and they have a rubric they might have to work toward. What if this kid first wrote his ideas as a poem? What if he first wrote his ideas as a letter to the editor, right? And went through a variety of different genres, and then we could help him see the power of, in an essay like this, actually staying really focused on what the prompt is asking and using the data. He doesn't use any data. They're supposed to use data. They're supposed to, as you can see, refer to the core democratic value. You can tell that's a favorite aspect of the rubric of mine. But what if we gave him multiple opportunities to get those ideas out and then taught him the power of the social science essay and when that's a powerful tool and when it isn't? Okay, so learning to write well. This is the explanation rubric that we use in science. This is how we teach kids to write a good scientific explanation. And this stands in stark contrast to the state rubric. Sorry if anybody helped with the state of Michigan's social studies writing rubric in the room. But this is very different. And you know why it's different? Because the kids generated it. The kids built this rubric, and I know you guys all know how to do this, the model writing stuff where you put the good writing up and you put the not so good writing up and you ask them what makes the good writing good and what makes it better, and then they figure it out and we produce it and we put it on the wall and we all start to work toward that rubric. But we also do other things, and I can make that rubric. It actually is already available on my website, so if you want it, you can have it. But what's really powerful about what we do in our science work is the kids are doing investigations. So they are doing the work of science, and then they're writing their explanations. So they're not just writing to some abstraction. They're not writing about whether, a ski resort town should, make people wear safety gear. Yeah, these are kids in Detroit writing about, the ski resort town, right? They're writing about something they did. And then we have them engage in museum walks and peer critique. And the kids will do stuff like, they'll be at somebody else's poster with that group's explanation, and they'll be like, dang! And they'll run back to their table and they'll fix their poster, because they're actually seeing, oh, I wasn't clear there. I didn't make that claim in the way I could. So it's this powerful act of, first, they're developing the rubric, then they're doing investigations. They do great investigations. It's so exciting. We study how much bacteria grows on the cafeteria tables and whether there's more before they clean them or after. And there's more after, which is really creepy. And they love that, right? Or, do artificial nails actually grow more bacteria than real nails? Really cool. Does the boys' bathroom have more bacteria? I love the bacteria unit. I'm a biology person. But, all of this work is embedded in real inquiry, and that's disciplinary literacy. So it's moving away from oops, let me just show you what that says, from these rubrics that are abstracted from reality. And that's what I want to end with, the dilemmas of literacy instruction in an age of accountability. One is writing to a rubric. I know that probably everyone in this room feels, some level of frustration, some level of power in rubrics. It's when rubrics turn into rules that they become a problem, and when they're problematic rubrics, it's even worse. This is the state social studies rubric. And just very quickly, from a disciplinary perspective, have you ever read a piece of disciplinary text that used one piece of evidence? Ever? Use at least one piece of data from the data provided. Now, if you're 13 and someone tells you use one piece of data, would you use more than one? I wouldn't. So, and they don't. And you know what's really bad? While I'm on my soapbox, the data are set up so that they're heavily weighted toward one result. And there's always one piece of data that contradicts that one result, right? And what do kids do because they're told to use one piece of data? They use the one piece of data that agrees with what they believe in, like, should security cameras be put in every middle school? And all the kids in the data table say no, and the kids say see. 94% of the kids said no. The end. The other thing, for those of you who are in social studies or history, the core democratic value. One core democratic value. Because, see, I think they kind of go together. Like the common good and right to, personal liberty. Like my liberty ends where your good is being infringed upon. But use one core democratic value and use one idea or principle. So this is a problematic rubric. So what do we do about that? The other thing I need to say about it, they're also asked to write mixed genre. So they're given this rubric, and then they're asked to write a letter. Now, really, how many of you use the core democratic values in a letter you've written lately, right? Have you? How many of you use data? Maybe some of us were a little weird, we might have. But write a letter. Write a letter to a school board member. They don't even know what a school board member is. So that writing mixed genres piece is really problematic. And then this question of writing objective pieces about highly personal or social issues, very, very difficult for kids, developmentally difficult. So to address those, we need to do task analysis. We need to start by saying, what are kids being asked to do here? What do they need to know? What kind of text does the kid have to produce? And what do I have to do to scaffold their thinking? We need to give them chances to write multiple versions in different genre, different registers. Write that letter, but don't put data in. And then write it with data and see how it changes the power of the letter. This is something that Bob Bain is doing some work on, helping kids go to the abstraction of the personal issue. So it's really not about security cameras following me into the bathroom. It's about security, more broadly conceived. So how do we help kids think about the bigger issue? And maybe that'll help remove the sort of personal piece. And then finally, explicitly critiquing the rubric with and for students. So helping them see the problems in the rubric and then helping them think about how they can still write a piece with integrity, but move beyond the limitations of the rubric. The dangers of disciplinary literacy, reifying practices. I don't think that we really do reify practices when we engage in this kind of work because it's all about moving across the disciplines. And with that, I'm going to move to that. So all of this is available on my website if you want any of it. If you don't, then, don't go there. Thank you.